So how should we think about the structuration of race? What kind of sociometric analysis could we pursue? These are the questions that animate my current book project, Asian Americans in an Anti-Black World. I'm going to try to take just a little slice of the book to present to you before we move on with affirmative action. Okay, so my departure point is Lewis Gordon's discussion of the two principles shaping the US racial order. Be white, but above all, don't be black. White is best, but the most important thing is not blackness. Blackness, Gordon writes, is the point from which the greatest distance must be forged. So, building upon Gordon, we can say the racial order is structured first and foremost by anti-blackness, the abjection of blackness, and secondarily by white supremacy, the valorization of whiteness. Asian Americans, I argue in my book, are positioned at that tense conjuncture between anti-blackness and white supremacy, where the elevating force of being not black meets the downward force of being not white. Despite significant and persistent inequalities among Asian American groups, even the worst off among them have something, in James Baldwin's words, something to lose, namely their not blackness in an anti-black society. So let me make this a little more concrete by discussing the original Asiatic in the American imagination, the Chinese immigrant laborer in the 1800s. Yes, everything always goes back to the Chinese immigrant labor, everything in Asian American studies anyhow, where we can see how not blackness was constitutive of the very concept of the Asiatic from the start. What we see in each of the three Chinese labor stories of the 19th century that I briefly touch upon in my book, Chinese wage labor in California, Chinese contract labor in the US South, Chinese indentured labor in Cuba, is that Chinese presence was always predicated on black absence. As we learned from Nadia Aram-Hario, Edley Wang, and Moon Ho Jung, Chinese migrants came to California because it was a free state that prohibited slavery and thus had an enormous demand for labor. They were transported to Cuba as part of the coolie trade that sprang up to take the place of the declining global slave trade. And they were transported into the South in the wake of the Civil War to help lock down black economic and political subordination. Global racial meanings shaped and were shaped by these global labor flows under capitalism. Both Western and Asian ethnological science placed Asiatics close to or near Europeans or with Europeans at the top of the scale, and Africans close to apes at the bottom of the scale. Asiatics were indisputably part of the family of man, and by the 1860s, China was formally welcomed into the family of nations as well, as indicated by the signing of the 1868 Burlingame Treaty with the US. Okay, and here Thomas Nast's famous portrait, the youngest introducing the oldest, and we see America introducing China to the rest of the family of nations. Note the absence of African leaders in this drawing, reflecting the widespread view, memorably voiced by Hegel, that Africans were marooned in time with the beasts of the jungle, lacking both civilization and history. The black was indeed the absent referent in white imaginings of the Chinese. It was the not blackness of the Asiatic, as well as their inability to vote, that made them the ideal substitute for black labor, the answer to the problem of slavery's demise. So I suggested that Asian Americans are positioned where the elevating force of not being black meets the depressing force of being not white. Does this mean that they are, in some sense, in between black and white? Not quite.